Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Nature Crime Alliance webinar. I'm Luke Foddy, Communications Manager for the Alliance Secretariat, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. Just before we get started, please note that this webinar does have interpretation into Spanish, French, and Portuguese. To access that, please use the interpretation globe icon at the bottom of the screen, and you can find different channels there. And please also be aware that this webinar is being published on the Nature Crime Alliance website at a later date. So over the next hour, we'll be talking about civil society engagement at COP16. And the idea for this webinar came about from conversations with members of the Nature Crime Alliance, some of whom are engaging with the CBD process for the first time, or would just like to know a little bit more about what to expect at Cali. And given that the Nature Crime Alliance harbors some considerable expertise, we thought it might be a good idea to go to our network and see if we can provide a session to address this need. And so we did, and we're here today. So on that note, we have two titans, if you like, of the CBD on the call today. In a short while, we'll be going to Dr. Susan Lieberman, who is Vice President for International Policy at the Wildlife Conservation Society. And we'll be hearing from Dr. Chip Barber, who is Director for Natural Resources Governance and Policy at the World Resources Institute. But before we get into the content, I just wanted to give an overview of the agenda for today's discussion. We're splitting the webinar into three sections. In the first few minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about the CBD's evolution, like where it came from, just to provide a bit of background context to people who might not know so much about the convention. Then we'll be looking ahead to what to expect on the ground at COP16, and we'll be asking Sue and Chip to share their advice for making the most of your participation at the COP. And then for the final 20 minutes, I really want to keep that free for questions. This is a really good opportunity to get some advice and put questions to two extremely experienced practitioners working on the CBD. And I really would encourage you to take advantage of this opportunity. And if you do want to ask questions, you can do so via the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So put your questions in there. And then when we move to the Q&A session, I will see your question and I'll put them to the relevant speaker. So I hope that's all very clear, and I really hope that this is a really useful discussion for us all today. So let's get underway. First, I'd like to go to Chip. As I said, Dr. Chip Barber is the Director for Natural Resources Governance and Policy at WRI, and he serves as the Institute's Biodiversity Lead. Thanks for joining us today, Chip. You've been involved in the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, since its early days. So I wondered, could you just give us a quick overview of the convention and why it really matters? Thanks.
Sure. Thank you very much, Luke, and thanks everyone who's joining here. I'm just going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how it actually works and where it came from, to a certain extent, things that if you're going to COP16 or you're following it, you'll hear a lot of these terms and acronyms, and they're, this is how it works. So the negotiation of this convention, which is under the United Nations, took place in the late 1980s, 1989 to 1992, and it was open for signature by heads of state and government at the UN Conference on Environment and Development in June 1992, often known as the Earth Summit. It was alongside the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, was also opened at that meeting for signature. So the U.S. George Bush, the first of those, the U.S. president, refused to sign it at Rio for a lot of different reasons. Although his successor, Bill Clinton, signed it the next year in the United States. It was submitted to be ratified by the U.S. Congress in the Senate, but it has never been ratified there. So the United States is basically the only major country in the world that is not a party to that convention. It's an observer. There's 193 parties. I would urge anyone interested to actually read the text of the convention. It's not that long, and it will make sense. You hear reference a lot to Article this, Article that, Article 15, Article 8J, and then you'll know where they are. It has three objectives: conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of biological resources, and kind of complex one, facilitating access and ensuring equitable benefit sharing from the utilization of wild genetic resources, which is often abbreviated as access and benefit sharing, or ABS. And that's an issue of COP16, as we'll get into. The convention creates a financial mechanism, which is operated by the GEF, Global Environment Facility, which was created around the same time. It was created on a pilot basis in 1991 and kind of became the full Global Environment Facility that exists now in 1994. A secondary fund, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, or GBFF, was created and became operational this past year, and that is to support the implementation of Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed at the last conference of the parties, and we will hear about that a bit later too. So that's just getting going. I should mention, this is probably of interest, one of the articles is called Article 8J, and it is a subsection of Article 8, and it is about basically indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledge, or traditional knowledge. And it basically says that each contracting party shall, as possible and as appropriate, subject to national legislation, respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. And it goes on a bit about other things, but it's worth, if you're interested in the issue, in those issues of indigenous peoples' rights and traditional knowledge, this is where that all hangs in the Biodiversity Convention. The Conference of the Parties is the top meeting. You have conferences of the parties for many international agreements like CITES, the Climate Convention, desertification, etc. It basically means the parties all come together in a body and they take decisions. They are the ones who, and it met every year for a while in the beginning. It first met in 1994 in the Bahamas, of all places, and it met annually for a few years, and then it moved to a schedule of every 2 years. There was a mechanism set out in the rules of procedure for the CBD originally for a voting process, which exists in a few other processes like the CITES Convention, which you may be familiar with. However, it was never agreed. If you go and you look at to this day at the rules of procedure, it's still in brackets, as they say, and things that are in brackets mean they are not agreed. So 30 years later, it still operates by consensus, which means that any one country who wants to block something, if it really wants to, can do it. Subsequent to that, there was the parties to the convention negotiated 2 subsidiary agreements called protocols, which is also a standard process. One was the Cartagena Protocol on Biotechnology that was agreed in 2000 and came into force in 2003, which deals with some aspects of the regulation of biotechnology arising in biological diversity. And then the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing was agreed in 2010. Excuse me, and came into force in 2014. And each of them has its own sort of structure from taking action and decisions. And those are called meetings of the parties. So if you see reference to COPs and MOPs, the MOPs are those, and all 3 of these meet simultaneously, at least this time they are. So while the Conference of the Parties is going on in some other room, the meeting of the parties will be going on for the Cartagena Protocol, meeting of the parties for the Nagoya one. So I know it's complicated, but that's how it works. There's a secretariat which basically supports the implementation of the convention. It's based in Montreal, Canada, headed by an executive secretary, who, if you're at the COP, you will hear a lot from. Astrid Schumacher is the current one. She comes from originally Germany, I believe, and worked at the European Commission. The United Nations Environment Program is the parent organization of both the convention and the secretariat in the United Nations system. Now, when you get to how it actually works, every conference of the parties has a bureau, which is basically an executive committee of the parties. They come from various regions of the world, as defined by the United Nations, and they're headed by the current president of the COP, which is usually a high-level official from the host country. So right now it's China, for instance, and the first order of business at COP16 will be to elect a new president, who's from Colombia, and a new bureau. They serve for 2 years. And they make a lot of the decisions during the process of the COP about trying to keep the process going. When things get stuck, how should they move forward? Should they structure things, schedule extra time, etc.? So it's quite important. The CBD has subsidiary bodies that are quite important. They do a lot of work intersessionally, which means in between the various meetings of the COP. And they can be standing bodies or ad hoc, which means that they're time limited with a particular mandate. So the two key standing bodies are the SUBSTA, the science, which is the subsidiary body for science, technical and technological affairs, I think it is. And the SBI, which is the subsidiary body on implementation, which reviews progress in implementing the convention, strategic actions, finance, which is usually called means of implementation. If you hear that phrase, it actually means money for the most part, and operations. How are the secretariats doing? So they craft recommendations in their meetings, and those kind of morph into draft documents for decisions, which usually form the basis for what is actually negotiated by the parties at conferences of the parties, the COPs. And all these groups can establish their own ad hoc working groups on particular issues or standing ones. There's an Article 8J working group, for instance, that's met for like 20 years. That's a standing one, and various ad hoc technical expert groups that go into the weeds on very technical issues. So this all feeds up into the COP. So it's a lot of material. We'll get to that in a moment. So the website is really important. If you have any interest in this, you've got to get really good at using the CBD website and its documents and understanding which documents are important. They come in a lot of flavors. You have what they call official documents under one tab. You have information documents, which tend to be more backgroundy and more technical and can be submitted by pretty much anyone who can get a government to sponsor them. Or individual governments. There are reference documents, which are usually reports of subsidiary meetings. There's a whole list of those for this meeting. Notifications just go to everybody and are things like, this is how you register information for participants, that kind of thing. Then during the meeting, when they have what they call in-session documents, which are very important, things that are being produced during the process of negotiation. Those come in various flavors, which are kind of, there's non-papers, which is interesting. Idea, a non-paper paper. It's just very informal is the idea. It's being floated as an idea. Conference room papers, which are sort of in process of going along, and then what they call L documents, which are pretty much decided, but they're not officially decided yet by the end meeting of the COP when it meets as a committee of the whole or a plenary. Then the website has lots of information on official side events, changes of schedule, etc. And if you're not familiar with the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, I would recommend getting familiar with it. They do great daily reporting in multiple languages on both the main negotiations and official side events usually. And if you want to keep track of things, those are your information sources, basically, aside from talking to people. There are 3 key official documents if you want to understand what's going on in the formal process. The annotated agenda, which is up there, which is all the agenda items and some description about what needs to be done about those agenda items. The organization of work, which is really how the sausage is made, as they say in English. It's the process on how is it going to be split up, who's going to do what work in what rooms, in what processes, and what's the schedule or the plan schedule, because that's hard to keep to. Then there is the compendium of draft decisions. It's very long and they're all stuck together with a table of contents. It's all the things that need to be negotiated. Now, each of the documents on each agenda item, the key bit is usually at the very end of the document. It's what is recommended for them to negotiate as a text. A lot of the stuff in the front is just background. And also it's in its annexes. So for instance, the one on the monitoring framework for the global biodiversity framework, which is an important one, the draft decision is pretty short, but there is an annex of what indicators, what data will be used to determine if things are being done or not, and how will that be done, is long and very complicated and technical. So that's kind of what is going to be a lot of the negotiation. So finally, in the meetings, what's going on? You have, like I said, a committee of the whole, or here they call it a plenary, which means everybody together in one room, and it's for formalities, the high-level speeches, and ultimately adopting the rules of procedure, and at the end of the time, it adopts the decisions. It creates 2 parallel working groups. This is a usual format. That's what's happening this time. And they each have specific agenda items from the overall agenda assigned to them. So some things get talked about in one room and some things get talked about in another room. And each of those get their own co-chairs, usually one from the Global North and one from the Global South. And the working groups, basically, they meet, they're still pretty big, to hear general statements, what different countries and regional groups think, and they sort the agenda items, if you're a good chair, into where a decision is pretty much agreed already or almost agreed, so it can just kind of get dealt with. And you put those all in one pile. And then you have another pile of ones where there are complex issues, controversial issues, a lot of strong divergent views. They get assigned to contact groups, which are smaller groups. They're usually open-ended, meaning any party can join. They usually let some observers in, but it depends on the size of the room. And they're given a particular task, like go and try and agree on these 5 paragraphs in this decision by Thursday, and come back to the working group and tell us if you've agreed or not. And that's what most of the time is going to be spent. If you look at the organization of work, you'll see they've allocated almost all of the COP is just contact groups. So that's where everything is going on. And informally, this happens, like hanging out, coffee shops and whatever. So that's like the main work. Eventually they report back to the working group, and hopefully they come to some sort of a decision that's agreed there, and that's get passed. If they don't, it gets kicked to the political level, and the ministers all arrive in the second week, and they try to break log jams and problems where people aren't agreeing, because ministers can, if you're a negotiator, you have a set of instructions. And if you get to the end of your instructions, it's like, sorry, I can't do anything more on this. I have my instructions. I can't agree to that. But your minister can say, well, we're changing it now, and I do agree. And, and that's what they do. They have more political latitude to actually reach deals. And as you can imagine, negotiators are often not very fond of ministers, because they'll have spent hours and hours and days trying to get point X in, and then their minister flies in and just sort of gives it away. But that's just the way politics works. There are regional groups, which often speak on behalf of their region. The European Union, Latin America and Caribbean group that goes by GRULAC, Africa group, the SIDS, which is the small island developing states, for instance. Asia group doesn't speak that much as an overall group usually. But they often, they spend a lot of time in their own closed meetings coming up with a joint position. So they can go in and say, the Africa group thinks X. And so you don't have to hear from every single country. And that takes a lot of time as well. Sometimes they all come together on the developing country side is the G77 in China, which is a very old phrase from long ago in the United Nations, but they still sometimes use it on some issues. And there are others that are they coordinate, but they don't speak with one voice. And that would include Japan, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Norway, Malta, a few others. So finally, there's a high-level segment also. This is going to be October 29th and 30th. And you'll see that that is a ministerial gathering that's hosted and run by the host country. It's not run by the CBD. In this case, it'll be run by Colombia. It's politically significant, but it's not formally or legally a part of the CBD process. It will come out with a Cali declaration or whatever they'll call it this time, which is usually pre-cooked. And it's basically 2 days and nights of fairly short, or sometimes not so short, speeches by ministers, just one after another. And it goes on in parallel in a separate hall from the negotiations. The negotiations don't stop just because it's going on. And as I mentioned, though, one of the real functions of having ministers there is they can break log jams and take political decisions that their negotiators aren't empowered to take. So they're around and running around trying to fix different issues during that time. So the blue zone and the green zone, this is the model that has been adopted. And Sue told me this is the first time, I guess, that they've ever done this in the CBD Conference of the Parties. A blue zone is basically for the month before, during, and after a conference of the parties. It's UN sovereign territory. For that time, it's not Colombian territory anymore. It's the United Nations. And it's run by the United Nations. It has tight security to get in. If you're not registered by now, then you're not going in. It closed in September. And inside there, you have the formal negotiations and a bunch of pavilions, which are being, in this case, constructed. And there's lots of those that all sorts of organizations are putting up. The government of Colombia, the United Nations. So that's inside. The green zone is in a different part of town. It's open to all. It's hosted by the government of Colombia and its partners. There's a lot going on there, which you can find, here and there on the website. There'll be more information soon. It's a lot of, issue forums and protests and all sorts of things, but also culture and music and things going on there. So it'd be quite possible to go to COP16 and not go near the blue zone and be completely busy and do lots of things and stay in the green zone, which I'm sure some people will be doing. It's hard to go to both of them. Not because they're so far apart. There's probably traffic and things, but because once you get, it's hard to get into the blue zone. There's a lot of security. It's like an airport. You got to go through like airport security, and there's big lines. Usually sometimes a day. Once you get in, you don't want to go out. If you go, you get it in the morning. It's not like you can pop out for lunch to do something and come back in. That's like really not going to be, I don't think, possible. Finally, there's a lot of side events going on. And by percentage, most people at COP16 and 100% of those in the green zone will be there for the side events. In the blue zone, you have official side events that are listed on the website, an exhibition, which Sue can talk about, because I know WCS has an exhibition in that, and lots of these other spaces where there's lots of things going on. The Nature Positive Pavilion, IUCN, WWF, Columbia, there are lots of those, and they each have their own very extensive plan. There are theme days, which are official kind of theme days set by the Secretariat. The Business Day, a Finance Day, Oceans Day, I believe, a 30 by 30 Conservation Day for the Target 3 target, etc. And I think and they each have their own agendas and things. And there's lots of receptions. Almost every evening, you can find 2 or 3 different receptions to go to. Food and drink, we've discovered, is relatively cheap in Cali compared to other places that hold these meetings like Geneva or New York or somewhere. So everyone seems to be having a reception. And if you're thinking about how to engage, these aren't just about getting some empanadas, which are really good in Colombia, and some beer, which is also pretty good there. But this is the place where you can actually meet delegates and stakeholders from all over the world that you would never, ever meet before. And it's really a work situation. So you want to actually make use of this. And I always say, if you go to one of these things and you're talking to your own friends and colleagues, you're just wasting your time, because you could do that back in, at your hotel. So that's an important way to actually interact with folks who are going there. So I will leave it there and turn it over to Sue, I guess, or back to you, Luke, first.
Thank you, Chip, for that very useful and comprehensive background. Hopefully that's kind of set the scene for folks on the call about how the CBD works. I'm now going to go to Dr. Sue Lieberman, who, as I mentioned, is Vice President for International Policy at WCS. I suspect Sue doesn't really need an introduction because she's such a key figure in the conservation policy space. But Sue, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate you giving up your time to join us. Chip's provided some of kind of the background. Could you kind of bring us up to date with the CBD, kind of the status of the convention, and perhaps give us a flavor of the kind of key issues that are going to be defining this COP in Cali?
Sure. Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Chip, for that introduction. And I see that some of you have put some questions in the Q&A, but if you have any questions on what Chip said or what I've said, we're going to be sure we have some time afterwards to answer your questions. So we don't want to do all the talking. For those of you who know me, uncharacteristically, there will not be a PowerPoint. But basically, what's up at this CBD COP? The previous CBD COP in 2022 adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Okay, it was adopted. Now what? This is the first chance for all the governments, the parties to CBD, to get together and say, how's it going? And therefore, it's not so much there's not going to be a report that says these are the 5 good countries, these are the 5 bad countries. There's no consequences if CBD doesn't work that way. It's very much what is called a framework convention. And the delivery of other conventions, CITES, CMS, whatever, also deliver on various targets of the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework. So there's going to be a lot of discussion on elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework, how countries are doing in implementing it. Quite critically, there's going to be a lot of discussion on finance, commitments that were made for the billions of dollars that would be mobilized to assist the global south and indigenous peoples to implement this. It's going to be discussed. How's that going? Where's the money? So there's going to be a lot of discussion on that in the agenda itself on the GBF and how's it going. And many governments are coming and will be reporting on their implementation of Target 3, 30 by 30, how is that going? But implementation on the other 22 targets as well. As Chip rightly mentioned, there's a document over 200 pages if you really want to read it, and I have, with all of the draft decisions. That doesn't mean these are the decisions that will be adopted, but that's the starting point of the negotiation. I think there's about 22 draft decisions. So when I tell you these are the priority issues, that's from my perspective as WCS. Someone else might say, oh no, you missed this priority because this is my priority. There's so many issues, no one person or even organization can cover them all. If you cover them all, you cover nothing, but there needs to be a focus. But these finance issues and the issues on the monitoring framework, the targets, the indicators are very important. There are issues around, as I said, finance, the resource mobilization, implementation of the GBF. There's discussion on biodiversity and health from our perspective at WCS, but I think many others and many governments as well. That's another high priority issue. There's an action plan on biodiversity and health that hopefully will be adopted, but a lot of it is bracketed, so there'll be these contact groups that Chip mentioned. Will be a lot of discussion on biodiversity and climate change, and a potential decision on the biodiversity COP, adopting to say how biodiversity, how nature delivers on climate change in terms of mitigation, resilience, etc., and calling on the climate COP, which will take place a couple weeks later, to recognize the value of high integrity ecosystems, forests, etc., in delivering on climate change. Those are some of the issues, and I encourage you, if you've not gone before, to read the first three documents at least, particularly the decision document, to get a sense of what are the issues. There are others. I didn't, if I list all 22 and give you a 2-minute description, I'll use up all the time. So, but I think that's the essence is, okay, this is the world. All but 2 of the countries in the world are parties to the CBD, but all the world comes together to this conference, but it's a conference of the parties, meaning of the governments. We as NGOs, as civil society, are there both to keep an eye on the governments, but also more importantly to assist governments. And many of us, like WCS, work on the ground, in capital, in the field, in land and water, helping governments to deliver on their commitments to the CBD. The GBF is basically a series of commitments that governments have made, and we're working with them to try to deliver on those commitments. Now, Chip had mentioned side events. So basically, you could go to CBD, to the COP in Cali, and only attend side events in the blue and green zone and never realize there are all those negotiations going on. But you can also go to the negotiations and be there till 3 a.m. debating paragraph 847 and never attend a side event. So there's a lot going on at the same time. And when you go, you need to decide what are your priorities. Your priorities, the networking, the side events, and the receptions, very important, or the negotiations, or both. So that's just sort of a quick summary of the key issues. I could delve into the issues, but rather than do that in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it back to Luke for the next phase of our input and then answer your questions specifically. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you, Sue. Really useful. And yeah, if you do have any questions, we are going to dedicate last kind of 20 minutes to a Q&A, and there's some in the chat already, but keep using the Q&A box if you'd like to get your questions in, and I'll put them to Chip and to Sue. So yeah, look, we've got a really good background now of what's going on with the CBD. Let's now try and drill down a bit more to kind of the practicalities on the ground in Cali. And I guess, look, both of you have been involved in the CBD, been to many of the COPs. Chip, in your perspective, I mean, what kind of advice would you give to civil society organizations looking to kind of engage with the process, whether that's kind of shaping the negotiations, if it's still possible to do so at this stage, or if it's just wider kind of engagement, perhaps looking ahead to the next COP? Thanks.
Sure. Well, I would say two things, and Sue will have thoughts on this, I'm sure. I mean, it's a place. I've gone to a lot of these things in my life, and it's always amazed me that when we sponsor people, and this is like the first time they've been to a meeting like this, they're coming from working in the field in a particular place on particular issues, and they've never met people working on the same issues in other countries. They've never met donors. They've never been a chance to speak to big journalists and things like this. It can be a really formative and interesting experience to, take your work you're doing in a particular place and the people that you're representing, and be able to take that forward, make common cause with other people, and talk to your government sometimes, or other governments about that, and so I think that's a big opportunity. It's hard to shape the formal negotiations on some of the big issues because honestly, the governments don't need NGOs to agree with them, in the process. They just need to get the other governments to agree with them. I used to do these negotiations in various forums, on the US side, and NGOs would approach me and want me to, do something. Can we have language that says X? And I'd say, yes, the United States agrees with you. We're supporting that language. So why are you talking to me? You should go talk to the African group or the Europeans, because they don't agree with that. I can't help you here. I'm already in favor of it. And they say, but they're not very friendly and they won't talk to me. And I say, I know, that's the problem. You've got to find a way to talk to the people who don't agree with you and get them to agree, because everyone's got to agree if you want a decision here. So, that's just the reality of it. On technical issues, there are lots of pieces. I think Sue raised health and biodiversity. That's an issue around zoonotic disease transmission and a lot of different things where, say, WCS is known for having a huge amount of expertise and knows what they're talking about. So there are governments who will come to a WCS or other organizations and say, what should we do about this? Because a lot of delegations are pretty small, so they don't have experts on everything on them, and they might actually care about it. Two, in regional groups, often countries don't necessarily agree with, let's say, the bullies in their regional group. There are some countries who will say, this is the position of the European Union, and there may be other countries there who are sitting there saying, well, I don't really agree with that, and so they may want help in bolstering their arguments to come to a better position in their regional group that's going to be taken forward. I've just seen that happen a lot of times where it's hard to get all those countries to agree on one thing, and when it's complicated, and if it's like all of Africa, all of Europe, or something like that. So I think there are opportunities to engage, but and the final thing I'd say is pick your issue. You can't do everything. If you're interested in oceans, there's a whole subset of stuff going on about oceans and coasts, and you should probably just focus in on that. Go to those negotiation sessions. Try to talk to those people on the delegations. Go to those kinds of side events and be part of that stream. And don't worry about, climate and biodiversity or something else, so that's, because it's impossible to do everything. It's like being in a giant music festival and trying to go to all 10 stages at once or something like that. You just can't do it.
Thank you, Chip. Very, very insightful. Sue, same question to you. I mean, WCS has been around working on this issue for a long time. In your experience, do you have any examples of things that have been really effective in terms of engaging with delegations at the COP from a civil society perspective, or any other insights?
Yeah, on the one hand, as I mentioned, side events, receptions, all that, it's a great opportunity to network and learn. Your best COP will not be your first COP. Your best COP will be your second or third, whether it's CBD, CITES, or whatever. So see it as a learning experience, and if you've never been, don't be stressed out because you can't figure out what's going on. It's okay. Nobody can the first time. But decide what issue you want to focus on, one or two, and focus on those. Again, if you focus on everything, you focus on nothing. Or if you just sit in the plenary, you won't have any idea what's going on, because that's when government maybe just gives speeches, but the real negotiation is in the working groups or the contact groups. Or you may decide not to go to any of the negotiations and just participate in side events and learn a lot and share a lot and meet with governments and donors. That's fine. I would say if you are engaged with some of the policy outcomes, then you need to work closely with governments. By the time NGOs, even if you get the floor, by the time you speak, if governments haven't already said it, it doesn't matter. The goal is not to hear yourself speak, even if you're incredibly articulate. It doesn't, that's nice. But you really want to find governments who do agree with you and can say what you want said. And as Chip said, particularly talk to governments who may not necessarily agree, but maybe talk to them. But be sure to get champions in government delegations. It's extremely important. Or if you can, it's probably too late now, to be on government delegations as well. And a number of NGOs do that. And we ourselves are on some government delegations because, as Chip mentioned, some countries in the global south have very small delegations. The government officials have never been to a COP, and we may be invited by the government to assist them and to help them figure out what's going on. But the important point is to sort of map it out in advance, look at the official side events, the side events in the pavilions, that those schedules are being posted, and focus. If you're focused on ocean, that's still more than 75% of the planet, and there's going to be a lot of side events, but see it as an opportunity to be as focused as possible. I encourage people to do that.
Great. Thank you very much, Sue and Chip, for those insights. We're getting quite a few questions flowing in now, so I think we'll dedicate the rest of the session to working through those questions. So I'm going to go first to a question here. Which kind of follows on from your last remarks, actually, Sue, is there a published negotiation schedule that includes the topics that are being discussed? And what is the best way to navigate those topics of interest?
The best, Chip can answer as well. I didn't mean to jump in. Just go to the CBD website, and you'll see, and there'll be it'll lay out exactly the plan. I think it's document 16/1/add2, just to be wonky, but it's the proposed organization of work, and there will be revisions. So you have to bookmark, and I can send that to you, and we can put it in the chat. But just look at the proposed organization of work, which already lays out what's proposed to happen the different days. But when you're there, please pay attention to updates, because the information will be updated online. There's not going to be a place for you to go to get the documents. It's all going to be on the website. So bookmark the website and consult it frequently.
Yeah, they often have big screens in the hall as well, which will have the daily schedule of what's going on that scroll by, but it is easier to do it, these days on the website. There's also something the United Nations puts out, very procedural, a daily journal for any kind of meeting like this. I'm pretty sure that I don't know if they're doing it at CBD. I think they do, and that is updated every day of what are the formal meetings and where they're going to be and things like that. But honestly, the best way to do it, it gets very complicated, is to know somebody who's a negotiator on your issue, and they will have heard it because they're always in there. And the chairs will announce these things. The contact, or the secretary will say the contact group on X is going to meet tonight from 5:30 to 7:30 in room 12. And if you don't hear that or know someone who heard that, it's going to be pretty hard to show up at 5:15 and try to get yourself in there. So this is another reason to follow one or another issue. You'll never keep track of of the changes, because the schedule always changes. It always changes.
Thanks, both.
And I would say, and I'm not being facetious, make friends with other NGOs who are also working on the issues, so you can work together and cover different things and share with each other. So if there are two things going on at the same time or something like that, but don't just coordinate with other NGOs. governments, et cetera, so that you can be on top of the issues that are your priority.
And there are organized things like the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity is a very organized network, for instance, very smart people that are doing good stuff. They focus on issues of concern to indigenous peoples, and they're going to be there in a big way. And you know, definitely talk to them.
Thanks both. Another question, I guess this is more on the CSO side, but is there a way to understand which receptions will be most helpful for networking? So, I mean, is there I don't know if there is a resource that's putting together all of the different organizational receptions. I mean, any insights on that?
I described it once as like, I don't know, I spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, and you'd be like at a beach town looking at which nightclub is going to be fun that night. And you just drive around on your motorcycle and you pass them all and see which one had the most motorcycles in front of it and figure, well, that looks like it's happening. And you'd go in there. And if it wasn't, you'd go somewhere else. It's kind of like that. Like in the pavilion space, there'll be receptions every night in probably most of those pavilions. And so you figure out what's the topic, what kind of people are going to be there, and who is it that you want to talk to. And you can just kind of move around that way. It's, it's sort of organic. It's not very organized, and often people will do it based on how good is the food, because they honestly, they haven't eaten all day and they want some food. So, it's there's a lot of food around these things.
Thanks, Chip. In a moment, we're going to go to a few questions which are more about the CBD on the negotiation side of things. But there was another question saying, for those who have registered for the COP but are no longer going due to various issues, will there be any hybrid or virtual options? Now, my understanding is there won't be, but I might be mistaken. Do you guys?
No, they broadcast from the United Nations. All of the plenary and working group sessions are broadcast and translated, interpreted into the 6 official UN languages. And it's not just live, because I've done this before. You can go and you can listen to it. So if you're really, really interested to figure out what was the statement of a particular country on a particular issue, you can go back and forth on it. It's all on YouTube, basically. That's the formal stuff. Many of the side events are also doing hybrids. I know in the Nature Positive Initiative pavilion that WRI is part of, we have a large room and a small room, and the large room is going to have the facility to do hybrids. And I assume that if you went to the Nature Positive Initiative website, they will have those recorded, and one would be able to watch them live, or if it's not convenient in your time zone, you could watch it later. So I guess the answer is yes, some, but not all. The contact groups and things like that are not, are not recorded and things like that. But there's lots. Like in the CITES things, I didn't go to the CITES COP a couple of years ago, but I watched lots of it. I watched Sue making statements and all sorts of things.
Great, thank you, Chip. That's a good answer. It's good to know that. Okay, so Sue, a question here more on the kind of negotiation side, but somebody's asking that countries are expected to come to the COP with their updated biodiversity plans and strategies, but not all of them are going to arrive with the most ambitious plans, or perhaps in different kind of status of progress. So what's the mechanism? What happens if countries just haven't really made the progress that's expected?
Well, I mean, technically, CBD doesn't have a compliance mechanism. There's no negative consequences if a country doesn't have a national biodiversity strategy and action plan, or their plan isn't very good. But there, other than social pressure, right? So there's going to be recognition and side events and recognitions of which countries have really advanced and really great plans. And so there's also discussion with donors, and many donors, bilateral, multilateral, and private donors, attend the CBD COP and are quite aware and made aware of which of the countries that are really doing their best and trying, and which are the countries that they haven't done anything. So that there are different ways of stimulating that kind of action. We as WCS are not going to put out a list and say the following 10 countries are doing a bad job. But we are going to, in some of our side events that we're hosting, have government partners there talking about the progress that they've made. So I guess my answer is there aren't negative compliance consequences, but there is, the Secretariat does put together a document at least of which countries have submitted and which countries have not. But I guarantee there will be many countries that haven't submitted it, but will submit it the first day of the COP. I hope that, I know, Chip, if you want to build on that, that's fine. I mean, it's not, there's not enforcement measures in CBD.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
that's it.
Thanks. We have a question here on nature crime. So Chip, I'm going to come to you first on this, but Sue, if you have any thoughts as well, then do chime in. But yeah, the question is, what is the CBD doing on natural resources crime, and what concrete outcomes will there be from the COP, and what has been done through the Global Biodiversity Framework on natural resources crime in the past? And also, are there any connections between this COP and the UNTOC COP next week in the context of nature crime? Chip, do you want to have a go at that one? Thanks.
Well, I mean, there are some people who participate in those. So UNTOC, for those who don't know, is the United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, which is meeting next week in its Conference of the Parties in Vienna, which is a very different kind of an agreement, and it has some focus. There's actually a resolution there that's, I think, Brazil and Colombia? There's a number of countries have put forward on crimes affecting the environment, including various kinds of nature crime. And that's hopefully going to go forward. I guess it's Peru and Brazil and a few others. Yeah, it's so that's good. I don't think there's too much connection with the Convention on Biological Diversity. They tend to be different agencies in the parties who participate in those. So in terms of the CBD, formally, it's not on the agenda, and I mean, it's obviously a key issue. And in that region, the Colombian government has made peace with nature the overall theme for COP16. And by peace with nature, I heard their Minister of Environment say this 2 weeks ago in New York. She basically said most of the high biodiversity areas in Colombia are not under the sovereign control of the government of Colombia with their armed groups and organized crime. And this is a key issue. When we say peace with nature, we have to resolve those kinds of issues. I mean, she said that publicly, so in that region where, various kinds of crime, natural resources related crime and other things, drugs and everything is so rampant. It's, in that part of the world, Peru, Brazil, Colombia, all those areas. I imagine that it will be a subtext for a lot of the discussions going on there, because I think there'll be a lot of focus on the Amazon region because of the huge drought going on and because of all the other issues going on, and because it's in Colombia. So no, formally, I don't think too much. Like the Nature Crime Alliance, we decided to not really bother doing our own side event there because but there are a lot of events. There are a lot of side events, actually. We've gathered them together, about 10 or 15 of them, which are focusing on, drug trafficking in the Amazon and how it's affecting biodiversity and et cetera, et cetera. The UK government is sponsoring a big one. WWF has a financial crime, environmental crime toolkit, which is being released. They've moved the UK embassy for the duration of COP. It will officially be in Cali, and they've rented a museum, and that's going to be the official UK delegation place. And so they're making a big deal of it, and they're hosting a lot of interesting events, and 2 of them, I believe, are about various aspects of environmental crime.
Thanks, Chip. I should just note that the Nature Crime Alliance is partnering on a side event with Peru, France, and I think
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the US with Wildlife Justice Commission. Yeah.
Yes.
And our colleague Lynn Schlingerman.
Yeah.
UNTOC, and our colleague Lynn Schlingerman will be at the UNTOC as well. So do grab her if you want to have a coffee and find out more about the Alliance. We'll just move on to
build on. Can I just
Sue,
build
please.
on that? And we're also hosting a side event at UNTOC. But I think building on what Chip said, I mean, I agree, but I think as well on the issue of nature crime, and the issue of wildlife crime or wildlife trafficking in particular, it's important to look at the GBF, because there's a lot of focus on 30 by 30, which is very important. But Target 5 of the GBF also says that governments commit to stopping wildlife trafficking, to also preventing the risk of pathogen spillover and stopping unsustainable use, but they have committed to stopping wildlife trafficking. So I think it's important when they talk about their national biodiversity strategies, it's important also to say that stopping wildlife trafficking, stopping nature crime is part of delivering on the GBF. It's not something separate at all. It's critical to biodiversity conservation. So I think it's important to keep that visibility high for the other targets as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. Very good point. Thanks for sharing that. Chip, I'm going to come to you for this one. You were a diplomat in the past, or a negotiator. Someone's asking, what is the role of the US in the CBD COP, given that it's a non-party to the convention? What role can the US play in this COP?
Sure. No, it's an interesting question because, and I did spend some time when I was at the U.S. Agency for International Development going to lots of CBD meetings, including a COP, and being on the delegation. So the United States has a delegation. It goes, it's an observer, so it sits in the back. You go A through Z all the way down to Zimbabwe, and then you start up with the observer governments. So I remember we'd sit in the back in those days. I think it was like the Holy See and us in Iraq and Afghanistan were the four who sat in the back. And, so we had a little sort of club in the back. The United States is the largest bilateral donor for biodiversity in the world by a fair bit. So, even though the United States was not a party, we have plenty of friends. Like, a lot of people are making the trek to the back there and sitting down and saying, hello, we really appreciate your support on what you're doing to, supporting us on wildlife trafficking in, Zambia, wherever it was. And so a lot of business is done on the side. The United States is also a big contributor to the Global Environment Facility. So that's another, so in that role, there's a lot of things to be done, although the United States will make very few statements, things like this. But behind the scenes, it's important. So that's, one piece. The second is that if you look at the issues about genetic resources and what they call digital sequence information and trying to create a global mechanism to compensate, for that, which is a real complicated issue. But many of the companies that would be involved in that, in terms of paying up, big ag, big pharma, big seed, as I call them, the big seed companies, they are based in the United States. So from a, I'm sure the United States is getting a lot of pressure to basically not put any kind of mandatory things in place that would basically tax those industries for their use of information derived from wild genetic resources in the global South. In fact, I know they are. I've seen it happening. So there's a lot to do for the U.S. delegation there, but it doesn't go at a very high level. It's fairly low key. So I hope that's an answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a question here about the peace agreement with nature that Colombia is proposing. What do the commitments in this declaration mean in practice, and how can Colombia advance its priority issues in the official negotiations? Sue, can I come to you on this one?
I haven't seen the final negotiated text of the peace with nature. I think the theme of the conference coming from the government of Colombia on peace with nature, I think is really important. And I think it's important for all of us actually to embrace, not from the perspective of peace with each other as well, which would be great, but also our entire approach to nature, and not in terms of our exploitative approach to nature as human society, industries, etc., all of the above, I think is very important as a theme. And, the Secretary General of the United Nations also recently said, we are at war with nature and we must stop that. Obviously, we're at war with each other. We also need to stop that. But I think if we want any kind of a decent future on this planet for future generations, we have to change and transform our relationship with nature. Absolutely. And if that as the thing, I haven't seen the final document, but I'm hopefully it gets to some of these issues that our food systems, the commercial systems, the way we exploit nature has got to change if we want a sustainable future on this planet. That includes climate change, of course. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Sue. I've got another question here. In terms of the negotiation progress and outcomes, are there regular briefings during the day, or do people normally have to wait till the end of the process for the readouts? Chip, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, well, there's two ways to do that. There will be I believe it's going to be in the basement of the main hall, a media room. And that's a good place to find out what happened every day. They sometimes do briefings there. You can usually wander around in there and, and hear what's going on. Talking to journalists who are trying to keep track of what's going on is another good way. They'll probably be wanting to talk to you more about what's going on, but they're often keeping track of that. I mentioned the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. They usually publish fairly late at night, and they will give a blow-by-blow detailed summary of what happened on different issues that day and what's expected. They have this sort of in the corridors section at the end, which is the gossip section. I used to sort of try and keep track of how many times I could get into in the corridors. It doesn't list who it is, but they say, an experienced negotiator said blah, 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 and things like that. So that's also a good source. And I think talking to people, basically people who are really involved in it, like Sue was saying, you just have to make friends with other NGOs, other people who are doing this, people on government delegations, because if they've been there all day, they'll know where it is and where it's going, what the mood of the room is, and what the chairs are thinking about for process and those kinds of things, and what's going to happen. Like I've been following some of the stuff on the digital sequence information, and when I was up at all the meetings in New York a couple of weeks ago, the kind of word on the street is that they're going to reach an agreement. There is going to be a global mechanism for this, that it will be there. The problem is it will not be in such a state that anyone will put any money into it. So they will reach an agreement, but probably not get any resources into it, at least anytime soon. So that will be seen as a negotiator's victory, but not necessarily for generating a new source of finance for conserving biodiversity in developing countries, which is the point. Now we'll see if that's true, when we get there. But it's possible to find these things out, by all those different sources.
Thanks, Chip. So if I could just press you on that point, I mean, you've been to a lot of COPs, you've been around. How optimistic are you for COP16 and the outcome? Do you think we're going in the right direction, or are we going quickly enough? How do you feel going into Cali?
Well, I mean, biodiversity loss has not gotten a whole lot better in the last 30 years, and my personal view of the Convention on Biodiversity is it started as a idea of peace with nature, basically, like Sue was talking about. It was supposed to be a deal between nature and people, and it's largely degenerated into a squabble between different groups of people about how do you carve up nature. So it's genetic resources, it's sustainable use and things like that. It's an awful lot of it is different groups of people, north, south, rural, urban, whatever, arguing about who should get what as between humans. It's really not, there's no seat at the table really for nature. They aren't parties, and so it's up to us to try and represent that. And I think that's what a lot of civil society has been trying to do. So I'm not super optimistic that on its own it's going to, turn things around and everything. But it is, I think the way Colombia has taken it up and framed it is positive and useful. And I think that we should basically be supporting Colombia and some, and other countries who are trying to do the right thing.
Thanks, Chip. Great. And Sue, last word to you on the same.
Well, I don't
question.
need the last word, but to answer that question, I mean, I'm a conservationist, so I have to be an optimist. I mean, you couldn't do this work if you're not somewhat of an optimist. If the governments would implement all of the targets and goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework, it's really good. We would be in better shape. But I'm not naive. They're not. So the issue is to push to the extent possible to make sure that governments support the implementation of as much as possible and work with particularly local communities, indigenous peoples, and NGOs to make it happen. But there has to be transformative change, and we have to connect what happens in biodiversity and CBD with climate change, which is undermining everything we're trying to do on biodiversity, and with the health issue. Am I an optimist? Well, I wouldn't be going all the way to Cali for 2 weeks if I weren't hopeful and optimistic that we will get some movement in the right direction. Am I unrealistic about it? No, but I'm still somewhat optimistic. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. Look, I think we have to leave it there. We're at time. Thank you both
Great.
so much. I really appreciate you giving the time for us today to have this conversation. I really hope it was useful for people on the call. Just before I go, there's a couple of things I want to mention. Crystal Davis, who's the Global Director for Forest, Land and Water at WRI, wrote a really good insights piece the other day, which covers a lot of issues around COP16 and is well worth a read. We'll be sharing that on our channels later. And so all that's left is to say the Nature Crime Alliance will be at Cali. Chip will be there. My colleague Elodie Pratt will be there. I will be there. Sue will be there. And so do come and talk to us, engage with us. We want to talk. We want to see how we can collaborate going forward. So thank you to Sue. Thanks to Chip. Thanks to Emily Vale from WRI, who produced this webinar behind the scenes. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your
Thank you.
mornings,
Thank
afternoons.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.